Night story. Due to life circumstances in my teenage years, I had to go live with an aunt who had grown fond of me. My mom had asked her for help because there were 7 of us at home, there wasn't enough income, we lived poorly, sometimes we didn't even eat, and that was starting to show in constant illnesses and malnutrition problems. One day this lady came to the house and my mom talked to us. When she said, "Who wants to go with Auntie?" Excitedly I said I did, thinking it was a trip or something like that. I didn't know I was going to leave home, be away from my siblings, and go live with another person I had never seen in my life. That same day, I grabbed my 3 little rags, a little Topo Gigio bag my grandmother had left me, a doll, and I left, telling the kids I would bring them back some empanadas at night. I didn't know I would see them again almost 5 years later. In fact, I never saw one of them again, but that's another story. What I'm here to tell you about has to do with one of the most intense experiences I had to live through in that house. The aunt? Well, the truth is, I never knew if she was really my aunt. My mom says she was my dad's sister, but I could never verify it because my dad never introduced us to his family, and when he was killed, no one except us and some neighbors went to his funeral. I asked my aunt about him several times, but her answers were vague, nothing concrete that would let me tie up loose ends. I only knew that she was a widowed lady with no children with a lot of money, and for some reason she lived in a huge but horrible house. I'll tell you details later. It turns out she was involved in commerce. Well, that's what she said. She traveled every weekend to Maichao and always came back with a bag full of things that I never saw what they were. What I do know is that every time she returned the following Monday, people would start arriving one after another from the same town and other places too. They would go into a room she had right next to the street door, stay for about half an hour or so, and leave just as they came in empty-handed. Honestly, I don't know what they bought from her or what they did. Well, at that time I didn't understand it. Now, thinking about it in more detail, I can figure out it was nothing good. They called her La Meona. A woman of imposing stature, painted eyebrows, grayish, cat-like eyes, hair blacker than any I've ever seen and reddish skin as if toasted by the sun. She wasn't a very attractive woman, let's say, but she wasn't unpleasant either. In fact, she had several suitors, among them a man who knew about plants, who always brought her essences and dried leaves. He would have coffee with her in the kitchen alone, while I listened to them from the living room saying things in low voices and laughing like 2 flirting teenagers. Today I think they were actually doing something else. It was from that man that I first heard the story of the Santo que Cris, the saint that grows. I remember I was cleaning some shelves next to the dining room, and he was telling her about a saint that had to be requested through a special order from a person who had the agreement of something called Las Tres Cruces, the 3 crosses. That those people were very few, and that's why very few people had the saint. Besides, you had to wait and see if that person accepted to hand it over because it supposedly involved a blood contract. I don't know what that is. Also, they didn't tell you yes or no. You simply made the request and had to wait for them to send you the saint or never hear from that person again. He told my aunt that he had a contact, a matron who could be the bridge and take her, but the journey was long because you had to go up a mountain whose name I forget now. Besides, they didn't let just anyone pass. The second time I heard about this topic was when my aunt was talking to a man who told her to leave town because they had sent someone to kill her. She said she was afraid because she had already sent for the saint and that they better watch out, the ones who wanted to harm her. Once it happened that some strange guys really did come looking for her. Innocently, I opened the door. I remember they grabbed me by the hair and threw me to the living room floor. They ransacked the whole house, pulled out a bunch of paintings she had in the first room which I never entered, little statues, candles, books, jars, threw them into the street and set them on fire with gasoline. They didn't do anything to me. They stayed outside waiting, surely for my aunt to return, but she, I don't know at what point in the early morning, perhaps sensing everything, left. It was about 1.5 years that I didn't see her. I was left alone in that house. Weekly, a package would arrive with money that they threw through the living room window. I don't know if she did it herself or sent it with someone, but it was sacred, every Monday in the early morning. With that, I bought food, and I remember I also bought some notebooks, and a neighbor helped me get into school. My aunt used to tell me that wouldn't be of any use to me, that I had to worry about helping her so I wouldn't lack food. However, I was already 14 years old. I saw my neighbors my age who knew things I didn't, and that embarrassed me. Every now and then I asked a little friend next door to teach me things, and it was her mom who, over 6 months, taught me to read and write. A year hadn't even passed and I could already manage on my own. I learned very quickly. I already knew how to add and subtract. They moved me to 3rd grade because I was doing better than many kids. Over time, even a teacher had me help others. And it was like that in the afternoons, a little boy of about 9 years old would come to the house so I could help him with math. It was around those days that, one Monday, a box arrived at the house with a hand of rotten plantains on top. When I saw it, I thought it was trash that some joker had left, but I noticed the envelope where they left the money was also there. So, I decided to open it. It was a ball of newspaper. I unwrapped it, and inside there was a little gray cloth bag like the ones they keep jewelry in, but inside there wasn't a bracelet or anything like that, but a little plaster figure. A little man with a tunic, standing with his hands forward like a saint. I immediately remembered the thing about the saint that grows, but it seemed strange to me. It looked like a common, ordinary figure. It must be something they gave my aunt, I told myself, so I left it on the dining table. From that day on, things started happening. I was alone in that house. I had never felt afraid before. Besides, the neighbors were always very attentive to me. They'd say, "Little lady, if you need anything, if any strange person comes to the house, let us know if you want some coffee." Things from a small town where everyone knows everyone. Besides, they seemed to have a lot of respect for my aunt. But that first night after the saint arrived, I never slept in peace again. I remember that time like every night I went to bed after a radio program I always listened to where they told scary stories. I didn't believe in that stuff, but it entertained me. I locked everything up, turned off the kerosene lamps, arranged my mosquito net, and lay down in the hammock in the middle room, one that didn't have doors but had two exits from where you could see the entrance to the patio, which was blocked with a piece of oak, and the living room door, which did have an old padlock. That house was practically half-built. It was huge with 3 spacious rooms. The rusty zinc roof was very high, so high that pigeons nested on the rafters, and it was almost impossible to scare them away. The walls had 2 rows of triangular-shaped openings in the middle part where the sun came in the afternoons. Everything was painted a greenish blue that was clearly from many years ago. Termites and crickets everywhere. In the house, there was only one of those small iron beds in the last room, but no one used it. In fact, that room was always empty because my aunt slept in the chair in the living room, and I slept in a rope hammock in the middle room, which looked more like a storage room than a bedroom because there was only a basket where I kept my clothes, and the rest was a pile of empty boxes where my aunt brought her things from my chow. I left a can of diesel ACPM under the hammock to provide some light because that house got too dark as soon as evening fell. Well, that night I was already falling asleep when I got the impression that someone walked through the living room and went out the other side through the kitchen. I just thought I saw a shadow like someone huge and wearing a robe. I thought it was just a dream, but just as I tried to stop thinking about it, I saw it again. This time, I saw the shadow directly passing through the living room. I was terrified, not believing what I was seeing. It looked like a man walking with long steps and his hands placed forward as if he were carrying something in his arms. I thought it was one of those guys who had come looking for my aunt the other time, so I got out of the hammock without making a noise, turned around with the diesel can, went to the kitchen entrance and shone the light, but there was no one there. Then I lit one of the kerosene lamps in the living room and realized that the little saint figure wasn't on the table but was standing on the floor almost next to the street door, which was about 6 meters from the dining table. I couldn't sleep that night out of fear. I had to light all the lamps and put a rag over my face. I didn't dare touch the figure either. That morning when I went to school, I left it there by the door. I didn't even go back right away. I had a snack at a teacher's house, one I always talked to, and on my way back I found the boy I helped who was already waiting for me in front of the house. The first thing I did when I entered was to look where I had left the saint when I left, but it wasn't there. I looked at the table and it wasn't there either. I peeked into the rooms and didn't see it anywhere. I got scared but didn't want to pay attention to it so as not to scare the boy too. So, I told him we should sit at the little table in the patio. There was more light there, it was cooler, and besides, there was always a neighbor in the next patio who every afternoon set up a fire to make pito, a corn drink, to sell. It was a matter of seconds. We had already finished some sums. I got up to stretch, peeked over the fence, greeted the neighbor who offered me a little cup of pito, and just as I was receiving it, I hear the boy let out a scream, a horrible one. The neighbor, alarmed, came running, ducking under the wire to see what had happened. The boy was in the hallway between the kitchen and the living room. He had gone to get his bag, which he had left inside. He was paralyzed with his little fists clenched, couldn't speak, his little face was trembling and he was breathing heavily. I asked him what had happened, but words wouldn't come out. At one point, I decided to check him because I saw something like a cut on his leg. I bend down and see 2 meters behind him, as if hidden, the figure of the saint on the floor. I remember that right then the neighbor grabbed my shoulder tightly and said, "Good God, what is that?" I looked up, and on the wall behind the saint, the shadow of a huge man was reflected, moving his hands. Look, I picked up the boy and we ran out immediately. When the boy calmed down, his mom came to the house asking what had happened. He said he had gone in to get his bag, and when he was coming back, he saw a man in a robe sitting in the dining room. He got so scared he tried to run, but the man swiped at him and hit his leg. In fact, the boy did have a mark on his right little leg as if a dog had bitten him. I was so horrified that I talked to the neighbor to let me sleep, even on the floor of her house, because I didn't want to go back in there. I stayed like that for about 3 weeks. Every night I heard someone calling me through the wall openings, felt like I was being watched in the bathroom. The pressure was so much that the neighbor stopped setting up her pedo fire where she always did, because she felt like from my aunt's patio door, someone was peeking, and when she turned to look, they would hide. One random day, my aunt showed up as if nothing had happened. She didn't ask about me, who was at school, didn't greet anyone on the street, went into her house and locked herself in all day. I arrived in the afternoon and waited for about 5 hours on the neighbor's terrace to see if she would come out, until suddenly she appeared almost at nightfall. "Come so you can eat," was what she said. She looked exhausted, ancient, with tangled and gray hair. She was a completely different woman. It was as if instead of a year and a half, 30 years had passed. I told her I didn't want to go in because there was something in the house. She responded that she had already taken care of it. For some reason, I decided to trust her. But I went in, and the first thing I saw was a stack of candles in the living room. On top was the little saint figure, right in the middle, and next to the figure was a plate of cooked rice. "Nothing is going to happen," my aunt told me, seeing my shocked face. But I wasn't about to be calm. She told me she had been hiding in a town called El Janito in Arauca, waiting for them to tell her she could return. That it was her friend, the plant guy, who left the money for me at the house. That she didn't know the saint had already arrived, that she had sent for it, but that I shouldn't worry, that it was to protect the house, that as long as it had food, nothing would happen to us. But that night was the last night I spent there. I never felt safe, not for a single second. Even so, I decided to lie down in my hammock, although I couldn't sleep. I just lay there stiffly while I listened to my aunt in the living room as if praying something. It got to be 4 a.m. with my eyes open, watching how the flame of my diesel can swayed from side to side, and sometimes the light became so tiny that it went completely dark. In one of those times, when it almost went out completely, I felt someone pass in front of me. I immediately stuck half my body out of the mosquito net, stretched toward the floor to pick up the lamp, and at that moment, illuminated by the light, I saw in front of me some huge black feet, like those of a monstrous man. Since my stomach was pressed against the hammock, I couldn't even scream, but with that, I threw myself out and ran. My aunt, whom I could hear praying in the living room until that moment, was in her chair, in a deep and silent sleep. The saint's altar was empty, as was the plate of rice. I stayed next to her until dawn. When she woke up, I told her what had happened and that I was leaving, that I didn't want to be there anymore. The teacher, the one who always invited me to lunch and was very attentive to me, ended up helping me. My aunt, in those 3 more years I lasted in that town, aged very quickly. I only saw her when I ran into her on the street. She didn't even greet me. She had grown to resent me. They say she made the contract with the saint wrong, and it, instead of protecting her, consumed her. Well, actually, I don't know if you should call it a saint. That was something else, something very bad. I've asked in several places, and only one person has half explained to me that it's supposedly something witches and people involved in dangerous businesses use so they don't get killed, but they say it's an agreement that needs a lot of energy and many offerings. In my 55 years, I haven't heard anyone else talk about that topic.